The night everything changed didn't start with anything dramatic. It started with snow. It was a Tuesday evening in January, somewhere in the hills outside Denver, Colorado. And the kind of cold that doesn't just chill your skin, but goes straight into your bones had settled over everything like a heavy blanket. The roads were barely visible. The trees were bent under the weight of ice. And the sky had turned that strange pale gray color that only comes right before a serious storm decides it owns everything in its path. Most people were already home by then. Sensible people. People who checked weather apps and left work early and had warm soup waiting on the stove. But not everyone gets to be that kind of person. Some people are still out in it, still moving, still working. Because the world doesn't stop needing things just because the weather turns ugly. Richard, a 44-year-old man who had built one of the most successful tech companies in the country, was sitting in the back of his private SUV when things started to go wrong. His driver noticed it first, a strange shudder in the engine. Then the vehicle started slowing down in that awful way where you press the gas and nothing answers back. Richard looked up from his phone for the first time in about 40 minutes and asked what was happening. The driver tried to keep calm and said they had a problem. The engine warning lights were all blinking at once. And then, right there on a 2-lane highway with nothing around them but snow and darkness, the SUV rolled to a complete stop and died. For most people, a broken-down car is an inconvenience. For Richard, it was something he hadn't experienced in over a decade. He had people for this kind of thing. He had a whole team. He had backup plans for his backup plans. But that night, his phone signal was barely 1 bar. The backup SUV in his convoy had taken a different route, and his assistant couldn't get a clear enough connection to coordinate anything useful. His security guard tried restarting the vehicle 4 times. Nothing. He tried calling for a tow. The call kept dropping. The snow was getting heavier by the minute, and the temperature outside was sitting somewhere around 12 degrees and dropping. Richard sat in that cold, dark car and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt completely and utterly helpless. His security guard pointed out a faint light up ahead. Maybe half a mile, maybe a little more. Hard to tell in the snow. It looked like a house. A small one, set back a little from the road, with a porch light on and a thin line of smoke coming from the chimney. Richard stared at it for a moment. His guard told him they should wait, that someone would reach them eventually, that it wasn't safe to walk in these conditions. Richard listened to all of that, nodded slowly, and then opened the car door and stepped out into the blizzard anyway. Some decisions don't come from logic. They come from somewhere deeper. And something about that light in the distance just pulled at him in a way he couldn't explain. Walking through that storm was not easy. The wind was pushing against him like it had a personal grudge. The snow was already past his ankles in some spots, and his expensive coat, the kind designed more for boardroom optics than actual weather, was doing very little to help. His shoes were completely wrong for this. His hands were going numb. But he kept walking, head down, eyes on the ground in front of him, 1 step at a time, until the shape of a small house started coming into focus through the white blur of the blizzard. There was a wooden porch, a doormat, a small potted plant that had somehow survived the cold sitting next to the door. He knocked. For a few seconds, nothing happened. He knocked again, a little harder this time. And then the door opened, and the warmth that came pouring out from inside hit him like something from another world entirely. Standing in the doorway was a woman. She was wearing a faded apron over simple clothes, her hair pulled back, and she had the look of someone who had been in the middle of something and had not expected any visitors. She was in her late 30s, with steady eyes and a calm expression that didn't flinch even when she found a stranger on her porch in the middle of Snowstorm. She looked at him for a moment, taking in the expensive coat that was now soaked through. the completely impractical shoes, the redness in his face from the cold. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask what he was doing there. She just stepped aside and said, coming out of that cold, her name was Diane. She wasn't the owner of the house. She rented a small room from an elderly woman named Miss Carroll, who owned the property and who Diane also helped care for. Diane was a professional cleaner. She worked for a small cleaning company 3 days a week. And on her other days, she took on private clients, helped with grocery runs, cooked meals, and did whatever needed doing for Miss Carroll in exchange for affordable rent. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was hers, and she ran it with a quiet kind of dignity that you could feel the moment you walked into that house. Everything was clean and simple and in its right place. There was a pot of something warm on the stove. A lamp was on in the corner, throwing soft yellow light across the room. It felt immediately like a place where someone actually lived and actually cared about the space they inhabited. She handed Richard a towel first. Then she told him to sit by the small electric heater in the living room while she went and found him something dry to wear. He tried to protest, said he was fine, said he didn't want to put her out. She gave him one look that made it very clear she wasn't asking. He sat down. She came back a few minutes later with a folded pair of men's sweatpants and a thick pullover that had belonged to someone else. Clearly, because they were too big, but they were dry and warm, and right then that was everything. She left him to change and went back to the kitchen without any fuss. Richard sat in that small warm room and looked around at the life this woman had built inside 4 quiet walls. There were pictures on a small shelf. A teenage boy in a basketball uniform, grinning wide. The same boy a few years younger holding up a handmade birthday card. Some books stacked neatly. A small cross on the wall. Shoes lined up near the door. Nothing expensive. Nothing showy. But everything in that room told a story about a woman who was holding something important together and doing it with very little noise. She brought him a bowl of soup without being asked. Vegetable, homemade, the kind that tastes like someone actually stood over a stove and thought about what they were making. He thanked her, and she sat down across the room with her own cup of tea, and they stayed like that for a moment in comfortable silence while the storm threw itself against the windows outside. Then she asked him simply, "Your people know where you are?" He said he'd managed to get one short message through before losing signal completely. She nodded and said, "Well, you're safe here until it passes." Said it the way people say things when they actually mean them and aren't just filling up air with words. Richard looked at this woman, who had opened her door to a complete stranger in a blizzard, handed him dry clothes, fed him soup, and asked for absolutely nothing in return. And something in his chest shifted in a way he hadn't felt in years. He had spent the last decade surrounded by people who wanted things from him. People who smiled with one eye on what he could give them. And here was someone who didn't know his name, didn't know his net worth, didn't know anything about him except that he was cold and outside and needed help. And that had been enough for her. Just that. Just a person in need at her door. The storm kept going. The night stretched on. And neither of them had any idea yet what that one knocked door was. Quietly setting into motion. The storm outside wasn't letting up any time soon, and both of them knew it. The wind was still, throwing itself against the windows in long, heavy gusts, and the snow had completely buried the bottom of the porch steps by now. Richard had checked his phone twice since sitting down, and the signal hadn't improved at all. 1 bar, sometimes none. The world outside that little house had essentially disappeared. And for a man who was used to being reachable at every hour of every day, that feeling of being completely cut off from everything was something between unsettling and, if he was being honest with himself, quietly relieving. He hadn't sat still like this in years. Not without a laptop open, not without something demanding his attention. not without the low hum of productivity filling up every corner of his mind. But in that small living room with the heater going and the soup warming him from the inside, there was nothing to do except be exactly where he was. Diane came back from checking on Miss Carroll, the elderly woman in the back room who was already asleep and undisturbed by the storm, and she settled back into her chair with her tea and pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket. It turned out to be a grocery list she'd been making before he knocked. She looked at it for a moment, made a small note, folded it back up, and set it on the side table. It was such a normal, ordinary little gesture, the kind of thing a person does without thinking. And for some reason, it stuck with Richard. She wasn't performing anything for him. She wasn't adjusting herself because there was a guest in the room. She was just a person living her evening, and he happened to be in it. He asked her how long she had been living out this way. She told him about 3 years, since she moved to take care of Miss Carroll full-time. She said it simply, and without any heaviness in her voice, just a statement of fact. He asked if she was originally from Denver, and she shook her head and said no. She'd grown up further south, moved around a fair amount after she got married, and then ended up here after things changed. She said that last part, after things changed, in a way that closed the door gently on whatever story lived behind it. He didn't push. He just nodded and let it sit, which seemed to be the right thing to do because she relaxed slightly after that. Just enough for him to notice. They talk the way people talk, when they're stuck somewhere together and there's no agenda and no performance required. Slowly at first, then more naturally. She told him about her son, whose name was brought up the way mothers bring up their children, which is to say constantly and with a kind of quiet pride that runs underneath every single sentence. He was 16. He was doing well in school. He wanted to study engineering one day, which made her laugh softly when she said it because she said he spent most of his free time taking things apart and sometimes not knowing how to put them back together again. But the curiosity was there, and she believed in following that. She said she worked the job she worked because she wanted him to have options she never had. Not just survive, but actually choose. She said the word choose like it meant something specific to her, like it was a word she had thought about a great deal. Richard listened to all of this and didn't say much. He asked a question here and there, small ones, the kind that just keep a conversation breathing. But mostly he listened. And the thing that kept striking him was how clearly she had thought about her life. Not in a grand, philosophical way. In a practical, grounded, eyes wide open way. She knew exactly what she had, exactly what she didn't have, and exactly what she was working toward. There was no self-pity in any of it. No bitterness. She wasn't asking him for anything, wasn't telling him about her struggles so that he would feel sorry for her. She was just talking, just being a real person in a real conversation. And he realized somewhere around the middle of the second hour that he couldn't remember the last time someone had just talked to him like that. Like a regular human being sitting across a room. Not a CEO, not a name, not a potential connection. Just the person at some point he told her a little about himself. Not the version he gave in interviews. Not the carefully assembled origin story his PR team had polished over the years. He talked about where he actually came from. A small town in rural Georgia where his father worked at a packaging factory for 31 years and never once complained. About it in front of his kids? Even though Richard knew now as an adult how hard that must have been. He talked about the first time he'd driven through a neighborhood with big houses when he was about 12 years old and told himself, one day he would live like that. Not out of greed exactly, but out of something more complicated than greed. Some mix of fear and hunger and wanting to prove something to nobody in particular. He talked about what it took to get where he got, and then he paused for a moment and said something that surprised even himself. He said somewhere along the way he had stopped being the person his father raised and had just become the company. And then he stopped talking and looked at the floor. Diane didn't try to fix that statement or smooth it over with something reassuring. She just let it land. Then she said, quietly, "Most people don't even notice when that happens. The fact that you noticed might mean something." It was a simple thing to say. It wasn't advice, and it wasn't flattery, and it wasn't empty comfort. It was just an honest response from one person to another, and it landed somewhere inside him with more weight than he expected. The hours passed the way hours do, when a conversation is actually going somewhere real. The soup bowls were long empty. The tea had been refilled twice. Miss Carroll had stirred once in the back room, and Diane had gone to check and come back saying she was fine, just shifting in her sleep. The storm outside had not quieted at all. If anything, it had gotten heavier. At one point, a branch came down somewhere nearby with a loud crack, and they both looked toward the window at the same moment, and then looked back, and she said, calmly, "Trees don't like ice," and he laughed. Actually laughed. The kind of laugh that isn't performed. The kind that comes from somewhere relaxed and unguarded, and she smiled at that, a real smile. The kind that reaches the eyes. At around 2 in the morning, she showed him to the small couch and brought out a folded blanket and a pillow without making any ceremony of it. She said the bathroom was down the hall on the left, and that she was a light sleeper if he needed anything in the night. He thanked her, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant a simple thank you in longer than he could remember. She turned off the lamp in the living room and went to her own room, and the house went quiet except for the wind outside and the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the kitchen. Richard lay on that couch in the dark under that blanket and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He was thinking about what she had said, about noticing. He was thinking about her son taking things apart and wanting to build something. He was thinking about the grocery list she had folded back into her pocket, like it was important, because to her it was important. Because every dollar and every item on that list was part of a careful plan she was holding together with both hands. He was thinking about the way she had opened her door without asking any questions first. He closed his eyes eventually. The storm kept going, and somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he wasn't quite ready to look at directly yet, something had already shifted. He just didn't have the words for it yet, but by morning, when the light came through gray and quiet and the snow had finally stopped, those words would start to find him. The morning came in slowly, the way winter mornings do, not with bright light or warmth, but with a pale gray glow that crept through the curtains and settled over everything quietly, like the world was still deciding whether to wake up or not. The storm had stopped sometime before dawn and left behind it a deep, heavy silence that only happens after serious snow. Everything outside was white and still and completely untouched. The kind of morning that looks beautiful from inside a warm house and impossible from anywhere else. Richard had slept better than he had in months, which struck him as strange, considering he was on a stranger's couch in borrowed clothes with no phone signal and no schedule and no control over anything. Maybe that was exactly why. He heard movement in the kitchen before he fully opened his eyes. The soft sounds of someone who knows how to move quietly in a house where others are sleeping. A kettle being filled. A cabinet opening and closing gently. The low, careful sounds of a person who is used to being considerate of the space around them. He sat up slowly, unfolded the blanket and set it neatly on the end of the couch the way you do in someone else's home when you want to show that you respect it. He ran a hand over his face and looked around the small living room in the morning. Light, and it looked exactly the same as it had the night before. Settled, cared for, real. Diane was already dressed when he came into the kitchen. She had made tea, and there was toast on the table, and she gestured toward the chair without any fuss and said, "Sit. Eat something before you head out." He sat. She sat across from him with her own cup, and they were quiet for a moment in the easy way that two people can be quiet together, when the conversation from the night before has already done its work. Outside the kitchen window, the snow was brilliant and blinding in the flat morning light. She told him that her neighbor 2 roads over had a truck with good tires and would likely be able to give him a ride out to where the main roads had been cleared. She had already sent a message through. He looked at her for a moment and said, "You did that this morning," and she shrugged and said she'd done it before she started breakfast because she figured he had places to be. That was the thing about her. She was always thinking one step ahead for other people without making a performance of it. His security guard arrived about 40 minutes later, having finally gotten through on a cleared road with a replacement vehicle. The guard looked visibly relieved and slightly embarrassed about the whole situation. Richard thanked Diane one more time at the door. He said it slowly and directly, looking at her, the way you thank someone when you actually mean it, and not just as a reflex on the way out. She nodded and said it was no trouble and told him to drive carefully. He walked down the porch steps into the sharp cold. Morning Anne got into the vehicle, and as they pulled away, he looked back once at the small house with the porch light still on even in the daytime, and then he looked forward and didn't say a single word the entire drive back to the city. His team was waiting for him at the hotel. There were calls to catch up on, a meeting that had been rescheduled, a full inbox, the usual machinery of his life waiting to be switched back on. He moved through all of it that day and the next and the one after that. Business as usual. Decisions and numbers and strategies and all the things that his world was built out of. But something sat underneath all of it now, like a low note in a piece of music that you can feel more than hear. He kept thinking about the conversation. Not one big dramatic moment from it, but just the whole shape of it. The way she talked about her son. The way she said choose like it was sacred. The way she had looked at him when he said he'd become the company and hadn't tried to make him feel better about it. Had just told him the truth in 4 simple words. He didn't tell anyone about that night for several weeks. Not his assistant, not his closest colleague, not anyone. He kept it to himself the way you keep something that feels fragile and real and not yet ready to be explained to anyone else. But he thought about it often. He thought about her grocery list. He thought about the cleaning job and the 3 days a week and the private clients and the room she rented and the son who wanted to study engineering. He thought about the fact that she had a dream she had mentioned almost in passing, so quietly that he almost missed it, about one day running her own home services business. She had said it the way people say things. They've been caring for a long time but have learned not to say too loudly because life has taught them to protect themselves from their own hopes. That was the part he couldn't let go of. Asked his assistant one morning to find out what it would cost to properly launch a small professional cleaning and home services company in the Denver area. Licensing, insurance, basic equipment, a simple website, initial operating costs. He told his assistant it was for a research project and didn't explain further. The numbers came back within a day. They were not large numbers, not by any measure of his world. They were the kind of numbers that would not even register as a line item on any budget he dealt with on a daily basis. But he knew those same numbers, to Diane, represented something that might as well have been on the other side of the world from where she was standing. He sat with the decision for 2 more weeks. He wasn't someone who acted on sentiment. He hadn't built what he built by following feelings instead of facts. He turned it over from every angle. He thought about whether it was the right thing to do or just a thing that made him feel good about himself, because there's a difference and he knew it. He thought about whether she would want it or whether it would feel like an intrusion into a life she was running with her own hands. He thought about what it meant to offer something to someone without it becoming about the person doing the offering. And then one evening he sat down and wrote a letter himself, by hand first, then typed up properly. And he read it back 3 times and took out anything that sounded like he was making himself the center of the story. The certified envelope arrived at the house on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the snowstorm. Diane was in the middle of changing the bed linens in Miss Carroll's room when she heard the mail slot. She finished what she was doing first, smoothed out the corners of the blanket, and then went and picked up the envelope from the floor. It had the name of a company on the return address that she didn't recognize. She opened it at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on and a half-drunk cup of tea going cold beside her. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat back in her chair and looked at the wall for a long moment. There was a formal letter explaining a seed investment offer for a small business, professional and clean in its language. No strings described in dramatic terms, just a structured opportunity with proper terms. And then underneath the typed letter, there was something else. A smaller piece of paper, handwritten, just a few lines in plain, straightforward handwriting that she recognized immediately, even though she had only seen it once before when he had left. Note on the couch that morning thanking her for the kindness before he left. She read those few handwritten lines several times. Her jaw tightened a little the way it does when you're trying not to feel something too quickly. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. She sat at that kitchen table for a long time with her hands around her cold cup of tea and the envelope on the table in front of her, and the quiet house around her and her whole life waiting on the other side of a decision she hadn't asked to be handed. She thought about her son. She thought about the word choose. And then she got up, picked up the phone, and made the call. The call lasted 11 minutes. Diane had rehearsed what she was going to say before she dialed. The way you do when something matters enough that you don't want to stumble over your own words. She had written a few notes on the back of an envelope, just bullet points, things she needed to say clearly and in the right order. But when the call connected and she heard his voice on the other end, not an assistant, not a receptionist, but him, picking up directly like he had been expecting it, all the rehearsed sentences rearranged themselves into something simpler and more honest. She told him she had received a letter. She told him she appreciated what he was trying to do and that it meant something to her that he had remembered. And then she told him she couldn't accept it as a gift. She said the word gift like it had a slight edge to it, not rude, just firm. The way a person speaks when their pride is the thing keeping them upright. She said if the offer was real and if he was serious, then she would take it as a loan with proper terms and she would pay back every single cent with interest, and she needed him to understand that this was not negotiable. There was a short silence on his end, and then he said he understood completely and that he wouldn't have expected anything less. She couldn't tell if he was smiling when he said it, but something in his voice suggested he was. Within 2 weeks, the paperwork was drawn up properly through his business office, clean and legal and structured exactly the way she had asked. A loan agreement with a reasonable repayment timeline and terms she could actually meet. His assistant handled most of the logistics and kept things professional and low-key, which was how Diane wanted it. She didn't tell many people about the arrangement at first. She told her son, who sat at the kitchen table and listened to the whole story from the beginning. The snowstorm and the stranger and the letter. And when she finished, he looked at her for a moment and said, "Mom, you gave a billionaire soup, and he gave you a business," and she laughed so hard she had to put her hand over her mouth so she wouldn't wake Miss Carroll. It was the first real laugh she'd had in a while, and it felt good. All the way through, she named the company Clearpath Home Services, and she started the way all real things start. Slowly and with a lot of unglamorous work. She got her business license sorted. She set up a basic bank account for the company. She bought her initial supplies carefully, comparing prices. choosing quality where it mattered and being practical everywhere else. She built a simple website with the help of a young woman from her church who did freelance design work and who she paid fairly because that was just how Diane operated. She printed business cards. She made a list of every potential client she had ever worked for over the years, and she wrote each of them a short personal note introducing ClearPath and what it stood for. She did not send mass emails or run flashy promotions. She just reached out personally, one person at a time. Because that was how she had always built trust, and she wasn't about to change that now. Richard had connected her with a business mentor through his network. A woman in her 50s who had built and sold 2 companies of her own and who had no patience for excuses but a great deal of patience for hard work. The two of them met every other week at first, sometimes in person, sometimes by phone, and the mentor pushed Diane in ways that were uncomfortable and necessary. She told Diane to stop undercharging, that her prices were too low, and that low prices didn't communicate value. They communicated doubt. She told her to hire her first employee within 60 days, even though it felt too soon, because growth waits for no one. She told her that being good at the actual work was only about 30% of running a business, and the other 70% was systems and communication and knowing your numbers cold. Diane absorbed all of it. She wasn't precious about being taught. She knew what she knew, and she was honest about what she didn't. And that combination turned out to be one of her greatest strengths. By the 6th month, ClearPath had 12 regular clients and 2 part-time employees, both of them women she knew personally and trusted completely. She was paying herself a small salary. She had made her first loan repayment on time and sent a copy of the transfer confirmation to Richard's office with a short handwritten note that just said, "First of many." His assistant wrote back on his behalf to acknowledge receipt and said that was noted and appreciated. It was professional and clean, and that was exactly what she wanted. She wasn't building a friendship on the back of a business arrangement. She was building a business, full stop. But then the article came out. A regional lifestyle magazine had done a piece on emerging small businesses in the Denver area, and ClearPath was included alongside several other companies. It was a positive piece, genuinely well-intentioned. But the journalist had done some digging, and the connection between Diane and Richard had surfaced. The article mentioned it briefly, describing Richard as a silent backer who had invested in the company after a chance encounter. It was 2 sentences, but 2 sentences was enough. Within days of the article going online, the comments and the social media posts started. Some people were warm and supportive, sharing the story and calling it inspiring. But a loud and persistent section of the internet decided that the real story was something else entirely. They said she hadn't earned it. They said the only reason she had a business was because a wealthy man had handed it to her. Some of the comments were mean in ways that were pointed and specific and had everything to do with who she was and what she looked like, and nothing to do with the work she had actually done. She read some of them late one night after her son had gone to bed, and she sat with her phone in her hand and felt something that sat between anger and exhaustion. The particular kind of tired that comes not from work, but from having to prove yourself to people who have already decided not to see you clearly. She didn't respond to any of it online. That wasn't her style. But she did agree to one interview, a longer sit-down piece with a journalist she felt she could trust, and she went into that conversation prepared. She brought her loan documents. She brought her client list. She brought her accounts showing every expense and every repayment made. She walked through the entire timeline from the snowstorm to the present day with complete clarity and zero defensiveness. She spoke about her son and about what she was building and about the women she had hired and why she had hired them. She talked about what it actually takes to run a small business, the early mornings and the difficult conversations, and the moments when you wonder if you made the right call, and you have to. Decide to believe in yourself anyway, because no one else is going to do that part for you. The piece ran on a Thursday. By Friday, it had been shared tens of thousands of times. By the following week, ClearPath's inquiry inbox had more messages than she could answer in a day. New contract requests were coming in from across the state. 2 local news stations reached out for follow-up coverage. A national women's business publication asked if she would write a short column about her experience starting a company from scratch. Her son texted her from school that day with just 3 words and a string of exclamation marks. She read it standing in the middle of her small office, which was really just a corner of her kitchen with a proper desk in it now. And she pressed her lips together. Titan looked up at the ceiling for a moment before going back to work. Richard saw the article. He read the whole thing twice. He didn't reach out immediately. He gave it a few days. And then he sent one short message through his office to hers that said simply, "You handled that with more class than most people twice your age and experience." She wrote back 2 days later and said, "I had a good example." She didn't explain what she meant by that. She didn't need to. And somewhere across the city in a glass office high above the Denver skyline, he read that message and sat with it quietly for a long time. The business kept growing. And so did something else, slowly and quietly, in the space between 2 people who were both pretending, at least for now, not to notice.